People with expired N.D.A.s, what juicy secrets can you share now? My mom had an N.D.A. while sitting on a grand jury for over a year. I prodded her all the time on the case and what she was doing for over a year of her life. She refused to tell me, only saying that, you have to be very careful about what's said on the phone, you never know who's listening. But you'll know what I was doing when this story breaks. Okay. So a few months later, I walk into work and see on the TV that our governor was indicted for corruption, including selling Obama's vacant Senate seat when he became president in 2008. Rod Blagojevich then paraded all over TV, including on The Apprentice, to tout his innocence and beg people to listen to the tapes that exonerated him. Yeah, okay dude. I have different information. I worked for an aviation company that, among other things, did charter flights. I had an N.D.A. that I would not reveal who was traveling with us and where they were going. This was for client privacy, as some people are wealthy and famous enough that they're targets for paparazzi, or even espionage or kidnapping or extortion, etc. So, now that it's expired, I can tell you that a minor country music star flew with us when his regular jet broke down, that the CEO of the local food processing plant goes to his Florida house about twice a month, and that's about it. Nothing exciting. The state of Oklahoma once busted a counterfeit check ring because the individuals misspelled Oklahoma on the front of some checks. They were damn near perfect copies with a valid account, check and amount numbers, and were caught when an employee who ran a sorter machine noticed a rejected check with the spelling, Oklahoma. I was that employee and had to testify in court regarding finding the checks. I think I'm still not supposed to talk about certain details, even though it was a long time ago. If you have a Comcast voice remote, and you say make Robert happy, it will turn the TV to Doctor Who. There used to be a lot of hidden voice commands in the system. We had to take a lot of them out over time, but that one is still in there. A couple people have asked me who Robert is. He is one of the software engineers working on the voice remote system. As a proof of concept early on, he put that in, and just never removed it. Some people are asking for another one. If you say Big Boss, it'll make your TV go to an empty page left over for the Minions movie, and make your TV play a Minion noise. It seems they removed a lot of them, but that one is still there too. Pasado's Safe Haven oversold their memorial dog cottages. So, when a donor, they cost $10,000, came to visit their dog's memorial cottage that they donated $10,000 for, Pasado's would have to swap out the memorial plaque. Super shitty. This isn't a pet cemetery. With a $10,000 donation, people got to sponsor a rescue dog by paying for a cabin for them to live in. That $10,000 donation came with it. This cabin was provided by a donation in the memory of type plaque. They sold more than $10,000 in donations than they had cabins. The Ajax's upper management has a serious cocaine problem. They completely killed Ace of Spades over dope money. They canned a community-beloved team and attempted to insert public relations agents into the community. They finally got Ben to move to London, where they dusted him with blow until he was finally hooked to the point of signing over everything and selling out his friends. It's not much, but I was part of developing AirDrop for Mac operating system X Lion 10.7 and was doing this on a 2008 Mac Pro. In the end, we were told it's not to be made compatible with 2008s and require 2009. That made no sense because I was successfully testing it on the 2008 just fine. It was a planned obsolescence, a ploy to force users to buy a new Mac. Upset, I secretly released a patch on MediaFire for owners of a 2008 to get AirDrop. It didn't require much, as I made the lockout as cheaply as possible. I also did the development of USB 3.0 support, and also did this on my 2008 Mac Pro. I should mention that this Mac Pro is a prototype with a unique firmware that has an in-sit BIOS setup, with all options available for debugging, of which Apple never asked back, and I still have today in my office as my daily driver. It has no serial number, and refers to itself as a prototype in any software trying to get a board revision. It also doesn't run the retail Mac operating system, hence I said BIOS earlier. It doesn't have EFI, so it runs Windows 10 today with a GTX 1050Ti installed, and still has the USB 3.0 card I had during development. Before anyone asks, no, I didn't steal it. I asked my supervisor if they wanted it back, and he told me to keep it. They had no use for it. At Variform, it's a factory that makes auto parts for Chrysler. They allow their employees to breathe in toxic welding fumes, and only when the government came around for testing did they add more airflow, then took them away after. Never gave the proper PPE for the work, always had ripped gloves, and worked with razor-sharp steel pieces. The temps outnumbered the full-timers 4-1. The temp agency doesn't even hire people who speak English. He literally just holds up money and says want. It's a mega shit show there. Lots of people are asking me to report it. I can assure you, it's already been done. Friends I still have there are saying air quality tests are being routinely done, but usually with the bay doors open for a few hours, and fans from non-welding lines to help airflow, then return to their rightful line. I appreciate the concern and advice from everyone. Thanks again, and good luck to everyone that's in this situation. I still don't want to say who, but a major jewelry store took my rings for resizing and promptly lost them, and by lost, they meant an entire truck of jewelry was stolen. They kindly offered to replace my priceless, to me, rings with equal value rings. Ha. Ha 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 ha. No, they replaced them with rings twice what the others were worth. I'd take back the originals in a heartbeat, but the replacements are nice. I worked at a printing company, outside DC, in the late 90s. We did work for the government from time to time. We printed materials for the investigation into the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas. There were tons of aerial photos of the compound, and for some reason, David Koresh shown many Camaros. They were mostly old beat-up ones, but there were a few dozen on the compound. But the charter school I taught for was in reality a Scientologist school. We had to do training in Scientology after school for 2 hours a day. We had to sign an N.D.A. to get our $1,000 bonus for doing the non-elective training. Those parents had no idea the school was Scientology. We did not teach them how to be Scientologists, but we certainly used the terminology and old L. Ron's ideas. This was about 25 years ago, before we knew much about Scientology. I didn't buy in, and I wasn't invited back the following year. The school dissolved about 4 years later. I had to sign a non-compete and N.D.A. when I worked at a successful local bakery. We didn't sell anything super extravagant, akin to your normal stuff like cookies, brownies, cake, cupcakes, or croissants. The most complicated thing we did was candy bars, but even they weren't patisserie level. The N.D.A. was just to ensure that we didn't share or take her recipes and start our own business, which is totally reasonable. We could tell people the ingredients because of allergies and whatnot, but not specific brands or recipes. People would come in and make conversation by asking what our secret was to such amazing treats, you know, just being complimentary and not really expecting me to spell out the recipes. I'd always playfully say, oh, well, you know, I can't tell you that. Or to the more chill customers, I'd say, I'd tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. Some people really wanted to know though, and I'd have to tell them I actually legally can't talk about it. It's interesting how when some people realize they're not allowed to know, they get ravenous about getting the information. I had someone trying to sneak into our kitchen storeroom to try and deduce something. The big secret. Good quality ingredients and basic baking techniques. Literally, that's it. People could easily find recipes online of close approximations of anything she made and recreate them to a comparable level if they bought good ingredients and learned pretty basic baking skills. Here's a tip that wasn't really secret, but I thought I'd share it anyway. In addition to getting high-quality chocolate for your chocolate chip cookies, try to get a few different shapes and cacao percentages. We used a higher percentage of darker chocolate chunks, and then melt chocolate buttons. The chocolate buttons melted into this amazing chocolate strata throughout the cookie, and the chunks stayed in nice blobs for a burst of chocolate. The cookies were big and delicious, and I ate one every single shift and was the happiest camper. My wife was born in Vietnam. Her mother met and married a Navy officer, and he adopted my wife and her sister, and got them all out of Vietnam in 1972, saving their lives. The majority of my mother-in-law's family were well-off business people, were ethnically Chinese, and were executed by the communists. My wife's dad passed away long ago, and my wife never did learn very much about his time in the Navy. All she could tell me was, he was involved with submarines. 3 years ago, we visited my wife's mom in Hawaii, and she gave us a trove of stuff, pictures, and papers she thought were related to his Navy career. The first thing I find is his service record. Holy shit, my wife's dad was a badass. Joined the Navy in 1940, was a chief mechanic on submarines during World War II, earns 3 battle stars. Then all kinds of work on advanced submarines, then later in his career some really weird assignments, like hauling stuff up to Alaska for defense radar sites or decommissioning ships that were used in nuclear bomb tests. It took a couple of weeks, but one day I noticed that his naval career ended in 1960, but my wife said he was a naval commander when he met my wife's mother. I asked my wife about this, and she was a bit confused. I asked what his uniform was like, and she says, khaki pants, white shirt. I tell her that it doesn't sound like he was in the Navy, and she must be mistaken. Then she tells me this beauty, no, he had to be in the Navy, because he went somewhere in a submarine and came back with crabs. I had to translate the argument between him and my mom. I'm really confused now, so I look at some other paperwork we had from the trove. There was a folder that contained some certificates from a Chicago-based air conditioning repair program, plus a certificate for electrical work, dated 1961. Then the real answer revealed itself. It was his employment documentation for USAID. Turns out, my wife's adoptive father was CIA station chief in Saigon during the Vietnam War, and she never knew. Her dad never revealed anything. I was working at a telecommunications company, the largest in my nation at that time. I overheard a conversation where two execs were discussing how they, illegally, bribed various politicians over $30 million for political kickbacks, which gave them significant control over a majority of the nation's infrastructure. It was only after their conversation had ended that they realized that I was quietly eating my lunch and had heard everything. Before 2 hours had passed, I had a 10-year non-disclosure agreement on my desk, and a threat that if I told anyone, they would make sure I never worked in the sector again. This was in 2008. I believed them and quickly signed the agreement. Looking back now, I know there isn't much they could have done, but I was 18 and naive. The company went on to make billions from its acquisition. Though their popularity has waned, they still have certain massive advantages over their competition for which the government has always looked the other way. They have used their extensive advantage to extort excessive amounts of money, and set wholly unfair business standards for telecommunications for the nation, especially in comparison to other Western nations. They acted like bullies and never got called out for it. Coming back to this, it was Telstra, in Australia. In 1997, they began the privatization of the network, turning Telstra from a government-owned entity into a wholly private entity. The government was extremely reticent to do so because it meant that they would essentially gain a monopoly over network infrastructure in Australia. The bribes, not overt kickbacks for MPs' families and such things technically legal, were paid over the 12 or so years preceding the full privatization of Telstra. They paid both sides of government, Labour and Liberal, to ensure that any dissenters would be silenced in the process. Once they had control of the copper and 3G networks, their plan was to roll out fibre wholly owned by Telstra to the nation, which was denied by John Howard, who was the PM at the time, bless that man. This meant that Telstra held a monopoly over all services for more than a decade, until the NBN began to be rolled out. This is why Telstra fought so hard against the NBN. The client invented a watch with 2 faces, so you could set it to time zones. Nice for international travelers who couldn't do simple math. My boss broke the N.D.A., and the company was almost sued. He had to pay them something, but I don't know what. The idiot told the client that he shared the idea with a sales rep from a watch company to see if it was a good idea. The rep said yes. Don't worry, the rep promised to not tell anyone else. I worked for Apple for a few years. It's a pretty good company to work for in general, but there are a couple of weird things. First of all, they go hard on the internal propaganda. When you get hired, you go through a tightly controlled 3-day indoctrination course. That's about 80%. Here's why Apple is the greatest company of all time, type of stuff, and 20% things you can actually make use of in your job. To be fair, the 20% is really good. I still remember most of it and use it in my career. They have customer service down, and they have solid training materials. But the longer you stay there, the weirder the groupthink seems. Your political standing at work is directly proportional to how much your manager perceives you are a true believer. It feels a lot like a cult once you're there for a whole. I also learned too late that, for all their talk about innovation and different thinking, you are absolutely not welcome to think differently. Which is sad because they actively hire young people who view themselves as innovative. Process improvement is not a thing. Rocking the boat is about the only way to get fired. I was one of the pilots for some stunt flying scenes in a recent episode of Fear the Walking Dead. The only bummer was that a good chunk of our efforts, particularly the highest risk ones, were left on the cutting room floor. Stuff like landing on and taking off from a small country road with power lines and trees on either side and at either end, with very little room for air width-wise, which ended up being the cakewalk of the project. The real kicker was having to land at night on an old runway surrounded by 6 80-foot camera lighting booms that only served to blind us, it seemed. landing mere feet away from actors, with the runway edges only being lit by a string of Christmas lights. Those lights had to be turned off for a good portion of our final approach for the sake of the scene, but we made it work. It took 3 separate attempts, but they got the shot. Despite the best parts of our scenes being left out of the final airing, it was personally rewarding to know that we nailed every bit of flying they asked us to do, and the production team was comprised of nothing but top-quality individuals. It was a very cool experience. I had an N.D.A. at the daycare I worked out. I wasn't allowed to speak poorly about the daycare for 3 years, or I would have to pay $3,000, I think, plus the tuition of any child that ended up not going to it because of what I said. Luckily, it's been longer than that. When I started, I worked with this crazy bitch, let's call her Brenda, in the infant room. Now, Brenda was probably in her 60s, but dressed like a 20-year-old in the 80s. One day, she showed up in a snakeskin mini skirt and knee-high Converse stilettos. Brenda was terrible with children, forcing them to eat by shoving spoons in their mouths and holding their heads. She would barely burp the kids, force me to change all of the kids, and never did any activities with them, even though that was the selling point of this daycare. I was left to do all the paperwork and enrichment. She also discussed getting raped with bottles in the parking lot, and stalking her boyfriend during the day while I was working. I went to management more than once to voice my concern about her. She was a danger to kids. They told me, and so quote, be a bitch to her, until she leaves. You know the boss won't fire her. Apparently, the daycare manager would get a good bonus, if she didn't have to fire anyone, so she refused to do it. All the staff were best friends with kids that were friends. You couldn't do anything with those kids, their parents let them run the daycare, and wondered why no one could get anything done. I had one of the kids say something incredibly rude, and yell at me, and her mom, the assistant manager, said she was done apologizing for her daughter. Excuse me. We were always told when parents were touring, so we could put our best face on. When you tour a daycare, you are not seeing what the daycare is like. Teachers in other rooms were regularly yelling at kids, pulling their arms, putting kids in timeouts, and not letting them eat with everyone if they acted up, which is all incredibly not okay. If you tried to do everything the right way, it would take longer, and you would get in trouble for not staying on schedule. I was invited to a pure romance party during my first week working there during class. There was a designated crying or screaming room. One of the parents pulled their kid out of the daycare and left a well-earned 1-star review on Google, and the boss required every parent that worked at the daycare to leave a review. Even relatives who never set foot in the building were putting in reviews loaded with bullshit. So, the grandmother of the kid wrote a review pointing that out as well. 2 1-star reviews don't stack up against 10 5-star reviews on Google, so no one really knows how bad it is. In other words, if you're looking for a daycare, don't go to any corporate daycare. They overwork and understaff every daycare, push teachers to the limit, and wonder why kids are constantly unhappy. I'm sure there's more, but this post is already super long.